So as Sarah mentioned, my name is Nelson Falkenburg. I'm the Siting Policy Manager at Clean Tomorrow, and I lead what's called the Siting Solutions Project, and it's a nonpartisan think tank, I hate that word, but we do that, focused on making sense of siting and permitting policies and designing new and novel approaches for states. For those of you who are new to the concept, when I talk about energy siting and permitting, it's basically who makes decisions about when, where, and how a project should be built and under what conditions. So basic definition for everyone. I'm going to jump in. This is my quick agenda. What I want you to take away from my presentation is an understanding of some of the biggest barriers to energy siting, some of the ways that state legislators are trying to solve these issues, and then a set of solutions that we think should be more thoroughly considered. And this will hopefully flow really naturally into the Michigan model. So it's kind of a lot. Buckle up. And if you have questions, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A at the end. And there should be time. So first, some of the trends in energy siting and permitting today, and then some of the biggest barriers to deployment. I'll begin by talking at really like macro level trends, and some of this for some of you is going to be like, yeah, I know that, obviously boring. But hopefully there's folks in the audience who this is new information. And then I'm going to delve into barriers at the federal, state, local, and community levels to siting and permitting clean energy. So the first thing I want to talk about is that power demand is surging. This is thanks in large part to AI and the resulting data center build-out, the fact that everyone is talking to ChatGPT all the time or has Claude plugins in all of their apps. And the demand is also surging because of increasing electrification of transportation and buildings. For over 2 decades, this was not the case. The utility industry was in a low growth period, around like 1% per year. And now the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is projecting an average of 3% demand growth over the next 5 years. So that may not sound like a lot, but it absolutely is. And then if you look at this graph from NERC on the right, you'll basically see that demand growth is skyrocketing. And so whether you are a FERC believer or a NERC believer, or you think that all of this is totally overblown, the fact of the matter is that demand growth is likely to be part of our future, and we should try to plan for it and anticipate it. And I just also want to acknowledge that there's extreme variability between different forecasts. And it's possible that this AI boom is a bubble and it busts. We'll see. But for now, energy demand is through the roof. At the same time, residential electricity rates have risen sharply every year since 2020, tracking and outpacing inflation. Some of you may have seen this on your energy bills yourself. According to LBNL, and we have Ben Hohen in the room, you can talk to him about this in more detail. The primary causes of rising retail electricity prices are grid infrastructure upgrades, volatile natural gas prices, and impacts from natural disasters and extreme weather, though there's a lot of variance across states. Additionally, the Energy Information Administration reports that in 2025, retail rates rose 5% on average across the US, and some states, again, have been hit a little harder than others. Americans are really feeling the pinch, too. 1 in 3, according to a survey from LBNL and Resources for the Future, have skipped essentials like food or medicine to pay their electricity bills. And at the same time, the fastest and most economical projects to build, which at the moment are utility scale wind, solar, and battery energy storage, are being blocked or restricted at the federal, state, and local levels. As you all are likely well aware, the federal government has revoked tax credits for wind and solar projects while trying to block offshore wind wherever possible. Additionally, and this came out really recently, an analysis from Crux shows federal permitting, even for projects not on federal land, is a problem. So federal permits, as many of you may know, can be triggered by species or habitat concerns, water wetland issues, historic properties, or any federal involvement in financing. FAA evaluations of wind turbines have a federal nexus, and then litigation can stretch permitting timelines too. Of the 50 developers that Crux surveyed, 3/4 reported federal permitting delays increased costs by 6 to 10% or more. And then as this graph shows, federal permitting delays stretched from 3 to 6 months into a year or multiple years. At the state level, legislators are really grappling with this issue too, and are trying to figure out how to address siting and permitting policy in real time. Last year, Clean Tomorrow tracked and analyzed 300 bills across the US that dealt with renewable energy siting and assessed their potential impact on renewable energy deployment, categorizing them on this spectrum here from restrictive to permissive. The really startling and stark finding was that there were twice as many restrictive bills introduced as permissive ones. In 2026, this trend is moderating a little bit. There are fewer siting bills because it's a short session across the US, and equal amounts of restrictive and permissive bills introduced this year. Though it's one of the big culprits from 2025, Texas, is also not in session. So not exactly sure how that would change with Texas coming up next year. But despite all the bills introduced in 2025, very few actually passed. Only 1 in 10, about 30 bills passed their state legislatures, most with a neutral impact, with restrictive and permissive bills breaking even. And the bills only passed in legislatures that had that were trifectas, so that were all Republican or all Democrat. There were no purple states that passed siting bills. So take from that what you will. And then at the local level, restrictions on clean energy are really proliferating too. And this is where kind of the crux of the issue. A February 2026 study from USA Today found that 24% of counties, which is nearly 1 in 4, effectively ban renewables. And that's an increase from 15% of counties in 2023. So not only is this an issue, it's just getting worse. And this graph from USA Today shows how those restrictions have grown over time. And this is corroborated by Heat Map News and Columbia University's Sabin Center, which have found very similar results. The impact is at least 17% of the US's total land mass is subject to some sort of renewable ban or restriction at the local level. And this is what I want to get to. One of the really big takeaways here is that siting is really hard to get right. The principal causes of project cancellations, according to a 2024 developer survey by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, are restrictive local ordinances, grid interconnection, and rising community opposition. But why are local governments adopting restrictive zoning ordinances and placing moratoriums on renewables? Well, it's not just NIMBYism. I know everyone loves to point at NIMBYs, but that's not all it is. Local communities also have some legitimate concerns and face real challenges. First, local governments are resource constrained and are reacting conservatively to pump the brakes until they can figure out a solution to siting these big projects in their localities. They're also reacting to local opposition, some of which is fueled by mis and disinformation, but some is based on totally legitimate concerns. Some of these concerns include changes to the local character where people live, localized environmental impacts like stormwater runoff or concerns for particular wildlife species, and a general lack of transparency in the development process, leading to a trust deficit building between community members and developers. And then finally, and we think this is really crucial, communities just aren't seeing the financial benefits of hosting projects. The tax revenue that communities receive is often buried in local budgets and totally invisible. Given all this, locals are reacting to block projects through restrictive zoning and moratoriums. So, to wrap up my whole kind of trends and barriers section, energy demand is increasing, retail electricity rates are rising, the most economical projects are being blocked or slowed at both at the federal, state, and local levels. And those are all challenges and headwinds, but we also see them as some of the opportunities here. We believe that good policy, like Michigan's policy, can help solve for many of these issues. So next I'm going to talk about principles and models that we think are good solutions here to address some of these siting issues. And we think principles are a good place to start, and these are all informed by some of our research at Clean Tomorrow, and all of this is in our field guide, which Sarah mentioned, and there's a link at the end. Feel free to check these out. First, I want to kick this off by saying there's no one-size-fits-all solution for energy siting policy. We don't think that there's a silver bullet bill here that's going to work in Texas and will work in Massachusetts. Everything needs to be tailored to the particular cultural and political context of the place. But we do think any good or effective siting policy should include these 6 principles and balance the rights of landowners with the role of government, parse the jurisdiction of state and local officials, and improve outcomes for communities. These are the 6 principles for effective siting policy that we've come up with. And I'll just give some examples of each of these. And there's a lot more in our field guide examples of each of these principles. So for clear rules, we think policymakers should define transparent criteria for permit approval or denial and ensure consistent application of standards across similar projects and jurisdictions. It sounds simple, but that's not the case a lot of the time. For timely decisions, policymakers should establish really clear, enforceable timelines with defined shot clocks for key milestones, consequences for missed deadlines, and reasonable extensions as needed. For fair process, we really think we should take some of the politics out of it and keep things transparent. So objective criteria should be used to assess a project's health and safety impacts while applying uniform standards and best available science. For economic opportunity, basically landowners should be able to benefit from their land. Policymakers should limit prohibitions on development and require any restrictions to serve a legitimate public purpose. For community benefits, policymakers should ensure dedicated, stable revenues to communities through different mechanisms like payments in lieu of taxes, development agreements, or annual per megawatt fees, as well as allow communities access to the siting and permitting process at different points. For land stewardship, policymakers should establish best management practices and a risk-based consultation framework with state and wildlife agencies. So those are just some of the policy levers that fit into each of these principles. A lot more in the field guide. Yeah, and just to suffice it to say, when developing a siting policy, these should all be at the top. Okay. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about different models within which the siting principles can be applied. And these are kind of 4 models that we've seen work at the state level. And this is going to feed nicely into the Michigan model. So the 4 models that we've identified at Siting Solutions Project are the safety net model, the threshold model, the guardrails model, and the referee model. If designed appropriately, these models have the power to effectively balance the roles of state and local government while also achieving those 6 principles that I just outlined. That said, none of these is perfect on its own, and none of them should be adopted whole cloth. These are just a place to start, and then you can layer on the different principles and build your policy from the ground up. These are a framework, a skeleton. Also, these models can be combined. It's common to see the threshold model or the guardrails model serve as the foundation, and either the safety net or referee models as an added element. The way we came to these models is we looked at where states have adopted renewable energy siting reforms since 2020, and we've found 8 states that have passed reforms and developed these models from those states. So that's California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, and Washington State. So the first model is the safety net model. This allows local siting where it can proceed productively and provides a state siting option when local governments prefer or refuse to adopt reasonable processes and standards. The benefit of this approach is that it sets a pretty high but attainable bar for entry into a state process and incentivizes local siting and permitting as the priority, so it's like the first track, while providing the state pathway as a last resort or a backstop, or as we refer to it, a safety net. A downside is it does require significant state resources to conduct state-level reviews. It takes a lot to set up this kind of safety net, especially since it may be used as a backstop and isn't the only path. And the best model of this is Michigan. And we're going to hear a lot more about PA 233, but this approach is really groundbreaking. It creates this compliance-based framework that allows local governments to retain control over permitting these large energy projects if they adopt a renewable energy ordinance no more restrictive than state standards. So this is a great approach. And then in the other models, as I just described them, they also fit into the Michigan model too. So the Michigan model really pulls from all 4 of these different models, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so effective, or can be so effective. So the threshold model allows local siting for smaller projects and state siting for larger projects. So a project that's 20 megawatts, for example, could go through the state process, whereas a project that's 19 megawatts goes through a local process. We think that this is a good approach because smaller infrastructure projects require a little less expertise from county governments or townships and are less contentious in general than larger projects, making them a better fit for that local siting pathway. One consequence of this is that it encourages sizing or it could encourage sizing or sequencing to avoid what may be a more strenuous state level review. For example, in Florida, the threshold is 75 megawatts, above which the state has authority. And so all the projects in Florida are 74.9 megawatts and below. There is not a 75 megawatt project in Florida since that policy was passed. And so yeah, and then there's also sequencing. Some projects may have like 4 or 5 different phases of 74.9 megawatts rather than one 150 megawatt project, for example. So that's a downside of this approach. And then the guardrail approach, this is also called the standards model or the Illinois model. This establishes setback distances, height limits, noise requirements, and other project design standards that local governments have to adopt into compliant zoning ordinances. And a benefit of this is that it allows the local governments to retain siting authority. All of it happens through the local process, but at the same time, while at the same time providing explicit, substantive, and uniform siting standards that apply across the whole state. There's a few downsides to this approach. Local governments might not have the resources to cite really big projects, cite and permit really big projects. This also removes some of their discretion to shape project outcomes. And so local governments may try to block projects through other means. And this leads to sort of a whack-a-mole legislating approach where a local government may create some new barrier or find some loophole, and then the state has to come back the next legislative session and try to fix that. And we've already seen this in Illinois. And it does mean that throughout time, the guardrails model and the Illinois model is improving. And the Clean Reliable Grid Act in Illinois is an example of that. But it's definitely something to look out for in this kind of guardrails approach. And there is an element of this in the Michigan model as well. And then the last model I want to talk about is the referee model. Simply put, the referee model defines a reasonableness standard to ensure local siting processes and outcomes are justified and appropriately applied. This allows local siting and can be implemented with, kind of business as usual. And the state agencies and the courts are really only needed when called upon. And there's, unfortunately, and that's the downside, is that these disputes over reasonableness are settled through litigation. Somebody has to get sued to address reasonableness, or there could be an appeals process. That's another pathway that is a better approach. So one example of this is in Massachusetts. The law states that no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall prohibit or unreasonably regulate the installation of solar energy systems or the building of structures that facilitate the collection of solar energy, except where necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. So really simple clause, and it's been in place in Massachusetts for 40 years, and between 2022 and 2023, it was enforced 5 times by the courts. So this is something that is tried and tested and does play out in states like Massachusetts. But yeah, relies on an appeals process or litigation. So those were the 4 models I wanted to talk about. Like I mentioned, the Michigan model includes kind of elements from all 4 of those models, and I think it's a great approach. I'm so excited to learn more from everyone else here in the room. I really hope that this presentation helps situate everyone a little bit in what's going on across the US on this topic. To summarize really quick, energy demand is increasing, retail electricity rates are rising, the most economical projects are being blocked, and communities are saying no for a whole host of reasons. State legislators are reacting by introducing a lot of mostly restrictive siting bills, but we think that we can bring better options to the table by applying these 6 principles that I laid out and working through these 4 models. So that's all for me today. Thank you all very much. Links to the reports are in the presentation. Thank you.